Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Brian Mills. I am the Director of Chapters for UXPA, and many of you know that that is the User Experience Professionals Association. We have with us today Sharon Carmichael. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about UXPA and Sharon's background before we get into the heart of the session. And I'm doing that because we have about 400 people scheduled for this, and some people are just signing in right now. So many of you are familiar with user experience as a whole, as a discipline. Some of you may also be aware of UXPA. But just in case you're not, the User Experience Professionals Association was founded back in 1991, roughly, to support people who research, design, and evaluate the user experience of products and services. We have about nearly 2,400 members worldwide, and 58 active local chapters in 29 countries. If you'd like to learn more about what we can do for you, you can always reach out to us either through our website, uxpa.org. We have a Facebook page. UXPA is relatively easy to find there. Twitter, our handle is UXPA_INT. Along those lines, I also have a Twitter account. If anybody has any questions about how to form a chapter or is interested in forming a chapter, you can email me at brian, brian.mills, M-I-L-L-S, at uxpa.org. Likewise, you can find me at on Twitter via Brian Mills UX. So, with no further ado, I'm going to take the next few minutes to provide a little bit of background on Sharon. Sharon has been in the industry for several years now. She is based in San Diego. She is a senior interaction design manager and community leader at Intuit. At Intuit, she runs customer experience special interest groups, and she is also a graduate of the University of California. So today, Sharon's going to be discussing storytelling and the art of getting the design job. Going to be a great deal of focus on, professional narratives as well as problem solving during the hiring process, because the hiring process in and of itself is a problem to be solved, as many of us are aware. So, Sharon, with no further ado, we're about 4 minutes in, and I want to respect the folks here who did join in timely fashion. So I'm going to hand over the process to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate that introduction. It's great to speak to UXPA today. I'm a big fan. I was just talking with Brian beforehand, and I was recalling that I actually attended my first UXPA conference about 20 years ago. And I've always been a fan of going to the conferences and watching the webinars and, of course, all the great resources on the site. So this is an honor to be here today talking about storytelling and getting the design job, and I appreciate the opportunity. So I'm going to dive right in. So, storytelling and the art of getting the design job. Thank you so much for attending this discussion. I'm just going to run through the slides fairly quickly, and then we'll have time at the end to ask any type of question that you like, and I'm happy to answer. And you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn, and my information will be sent out after this webinar. So a little bit more about me and my background. I've done a lot of hiring over the years. I've been in this industry for about 20 years, and I've managed a bunch of different teams at small companies as well as large ones. In the last 3 years here at Intuit, I have interviewed probably upwards of 30 people, and I've hired almost, I think, 15 or more. Actually, more than that. So I probably hired close to 20, including full-time employees and contractors, which means I must have interviewed many, many more, and of course looked at a zillion portfolios and resumes. So I do have some pet peeves, and I always like to call that out. I really have a pet peeve around people who show up for an interview with neither a laptop or a tablet or even a phone. It has happened. People laugh when I say that, but it is always shocking when someone doesn't have a device to showcase their portfolio on. So just want to call that out. All right, let's get started. So I have 3 major topic areas for this talk today. The first is really about knowing myself and doing a good amount of research into yourself before you actually start the portfolio design process and then interviewing. Then we're going to talk around a portfolio and how to craft that well in order to get your foot in the door. Then we're going to talk about when you actually have that interview, what does a good portfolio presentation look like, and what should the story arcs be for that portfolio presentation. And then at the end, we're going to tackle some questions. So think of those along the way, and I'm happy to answer them. So the hiring process. Most of you guys have been on the interview side, but probably only a handful of you have actually been the hiring manager themselves. So I know when I have been a hiring manager, I will post a job and I will get 23 to 30 resumes for each of those jobs. And I will vet them. I will look through them. Sometimes I'll scan. Mostly I'll scan because that's a lot of resumes to go through. Sometimes if I'm lucky, I'll have someone else to look through them for me. But usually I'm looking for the highlights, like, you know, do they have the skills? What makes them stand out? What kind of background experience do they have? Is it a well-formatted resume? And generally, I don't post very general job postings. I post very specific ones because I'm generally looking for someone who has a specific type of skill, certain level of experience, and of course, someone who'll be a good cultural fit. So I'll look through those resumes and I'll pick out a few. Then I'll do anywhere from 5 to 8 phone screens. And so this will ideally be over Skype or in some way where I can get to know the person, but also review their portfolio at a high level and see if it's a good fit between myself and the person I'm interviewing. From there, I will schedule 2 to 3 on-site interviews. And for me, the way that I do them is generally quite lengthy. It'll be an hour portfolio review and then several one-on-one interviews with myself and other team members. And then from there, my goal is to have one hire. So as you guys can see, from a hiring manager perspective, it's a lengthy process, and it's done carefully and with a lot of diligence. And so I'm going to take some of the learnings that I have experienced over the last few years from going through this process many times and speak to you about the things that I've learned and how to make yourself really stand out in terms of the process. So the first step in any design project is really to research the problem itself. And in this case, the problem is that you, as a designer, want to get a new job. And that can be for any number of reasons. But it's key in this process to do the right kind of research and really understand yourself. I say write it in a journal, interview people, ask other people questions, find out as much as you can about yourself, and really think about who you are as a person and as a designer. So in doing this process around asking yourself these questions and doing the research on yourself, it's important to really understand your design journey. Each of us has gotten to where we are in our career on a very different path. Each of us as individuals, and we're unique, and some of us may have more traditional backgrounds, having gone to design school. Some of us may have gone on a very circuitous route. I know myself, I did. I actually studied fine art and printmaking and political science, and here I am having been in the design field for 20 years. It's important to know why you're passionate about design. You can't speak eloquently in a way that is attractive to other people about design unless you're talking about what you're really passionate about in that field. And then, of course, it's important to know who and what your design inspirations are. Who really gets you up in the morning where you're like, I can't wait to see the design by this person. I can't wait to see how they come out with X product or Y product or an app on your phone. All those things, document them, put them down, really understand what it is about design that really, really matters to you. And then out of that, kind of craft a story for yourself around what kind of designer you are today and what kind of designer you want to be. Because we're all on a journey in our careers. And so when we're starting out, we may be a certain type of designer, able to do sketches very quickly and come up with rapid ideas. But then later, as we go through our career, perhaps we want to grow our career and become more of a strategic thinker and more of a visionary. We can do that. You just need to understand who you are in that journey, your current kind of designer, and then where you want to go, and speak to both of those in terms of your journey line for this. So I also recommend to everyone that I mentor in terms of the interview and hiring process, research the competitive landscape. How do you compare to other people in the design market? Not just in the design industry, but also within your current regional area. So I know in San Diego, we hire certain types of designers. Biotech is really important. Intuit, where I work today, is an amazing design studio here in San Diego. But there's lots of smaller agencies as well. You know, if you're in the Midwest, say Kansas City, it's a different kind of market for designers. Or if you're in Washington, D.C., that too, great market, but it's different. So really understand the type of companies that are in that market and the type of designers. Are there a lot of designers who focus on rapid prototyping and agency work? Are there a lot of designers who are more product designers? Kind of understand where you are in terms of that landscape. And then, of course, you want to figure out, once you understand the types of designers around you, how can you stand out and make yourself different? Make yourself someone that would appeal in that market with a certain set of skills and potentially even experiences. If you live in a town where you know there's a great startup community, maybe you can stand out by showcasing startup work that you've done. Maybe if it's a product town that does a lot of enterprise products, maybe you can showcase that in terms of how the work that you're showing, what you want to showcase to stand out. Maybe it's a lot of visual work. Those are things that you really have to think about. And then I also mentor and coach people to think about their values as well. So oftentimes when we're going for a job, we just want the job. And we're not really thinking too much around what's important to us as people. What do we need in order to be our true, authentic selves at work? And so I think it's important to understand your own values as you look for a job in order to make sure that there's a good match and a good fit in terms of that company culture and the type of work that you would be doing. Because that will really showcase and shine through in the interview process. And then also it's important to think about what type of job are you interested in. You know, there are many, many different types of design jobs, as all of you know, and sometimes it's good to focus on getting one type of job if that's really a type of job that you're passionate about. That will also definitely show up in the process for interviewing. So I also think it's important to really understand your T-shape. And I use this expression a lot when I'm talking about job roles and competencies. And I don't know how familiar it is across the design industry. It probably is very familiar, but this is the idea of the T-shape is really how you can think about your overall portfolio of knowledge around design. So the top of the T is your breadth of knowledge. So all of us have a wide variety of skills and a diversity of knowledge. But we also have, for most of us, a piece of craft. And so for myself, using myself as an example, my deep craft knowledge is around interaction design. That also includes information architecture and taxonomy work as part of my deep craft focus. But my breadth of knowledge includes actually thinking about business strategy, user research, a little bit of visual design, and rapid prototyping. Those are all parts of my skill set in terms of the breadth of knowledge and what I can do. And I'd also throw in leadership capabilities, empowering people, and managing teams. And so when I map out my T-shape, I want to make sure that I am showcasing my deep craft and the focus that I can bring to any kind of design job. But I also want to make sure that I hit upon all of those areas that are at the top of the T-shape in terms of the things that I can bring outside of just the craft to a job. Excuse me. And then I think in this research process, it's also really important to think about the type of environment that you thrive in. Because again, that will show up in terms of your passion for a job and how you interview for it. So if you absolutely adore working for startups, and you have experience with that, and you're really passionate about a small company and working on a small team, by all means focus on that, because that passion will show up. If you want to work on a large global team, that will show up as well. If you don't know, that's okay. But this is where it's important to do some of the research and kind of put yourself in the mindset of what would it be like to work on a large team? What would it be like to be a sole designer in a team of one at a company, which for a lot of us as designers happens frequently. And if you don't know, if you're still in that question of what it would be a good environment for you, by all means, reach out to people in the design community and talk to them about what it's like for them to work on their team, in their corporate environment, in their freelance role. All of those are great questions to explore as you do your job search and spread out and start applying for jobs. So, moving on, and we're going through these fairly quickly, so we're going to have a lot of time to ask questions at the end. But I wanted to talk about the online portfolio as part of the next section, because this, in addition to the resume, is really how you get your foot in the door. And a lot of people who are fabulous designers really don't spend enough time crafting their actual online portfolio. And I would throw out a hypothesis that if you really want that design job, it is almost like a second job, not for forever, but it's almost like a second job to really put in the time and effort needed to craft that online portfolio in order to make sure that it really sparkles and shines for those hiring managers. So let's talk about that online portfolio, which really is your foot in the studio door. It's the one thing. You have a resume, it looks great, scanning through it. The first thing I'm going to do after looking at your resume is I'm going to go look at your online portfolio. And I only have a few seconds based on that first page on your portfolio site to really understand who you are, really understand whether you might be a good fit for the role, and whether there's something of interest on that page. So I call out on this slide 37 pieces of flair. And that really isn't 37 pieces of flair, but that's really what can you do on your online portfolio to make it stand out. And that can be with engaging, beautiful photography. It can be with telling a really interesting story about yourself on the homepage. It can be some kind of animatic on that page that draws a person in and makes you want to discover more. There's a million different ways to do that, but having something that really draws that hiring manager in to want to learn more about you is so very important in that portfolio. Spend the time to craft your portfolio. Excuse me. Storyboard it out beforehand. Make sure that you have a network of people who are ready and willing to review your portfolio for you. If content is not your thing, make sure that you have a friend who is a content designer who can help you craft the words on your page so that they're meaningful and they resonate. Words on a site are far more important than people actually think they are. I'm not saying have a lot of content, a lot of words on your page, or on your full site, but the words that you have on your site really, really matter. And of course, curate the work. This is what we do as designers anyway, but curate the work so you're only showing your best pieces, and you're showing the pieces that really showcase who you are as a designer today and who you want to be as a designer in the future. So if you have a project that is showing enterprise work and it's a little bit out of date and staid, my recommendation is don't include it if you only want to go forward and design mobile apps, because that enterprise software, while for you, that may be one of the biggest projects you ever worked on. It's not truly relevant to what you want to do in the future. I caveat that with the idea that you can show that piece if it can speak to a higher aspiration of yours. So if that portfolio piece, while outdated and not showing the type of work that you want to do in the future, if you can use that to then showcase excuse me, your amazing leadership skills, or how you showcased conflict resolution, excuse me, or great technical innovation, then you can keep that piece in there. But if you're just showing it as a piece of work to show that you have a solid design background, my recommendation is to cut it and show more inspiring pieces that really showcase the work that you want to do going forward. And that's what I mean when I say focus on the future. So it does no good to me as a hiring manager for me to see just the work that you've done unless it's something that really applies to the role that you want going forward. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking your portfolio pieces. Think in mind, what is that hiring manager really looking for? What is the corporation doing? And let's just say it's a corporation. It could be a small company. What kind of design work are they going to be doing over the next 1 to 3 years? And how can my portfolio showcase that I can do that work and really, really grow in that role at that company? Those are really important ways to think of your portfolio and how you present yourself. And so part of that is also thinking about the companies that you're applying for, because relevance truly does matter. I work for a company. I'm very proud to work in Intuit, and I love the work that I do here on TurboTax. We are a consumer product, and so when I am hiring people for roles here, I'm looking for people who understand consumers, have empathy for them, can showcase how they have done research with consumers or put together great designs that solve problems for consumers. That's what I'm looking for when I'm hiring people. But other companies are looking for other types of designers. So a biotech company may be looking for someone who has a little bit more of a science background and is able to put together major enterprise software that still can identify with FDA rules. I don't know. I don't know biotech at all. But I'm trying to use that as an example of what other companies might be looking for. And then, you know, it's really important to target companies. I know the easier way is to have a generic portfolio site that just includes a lot of very different work. But that's like throwing a spitball at the wall and really hoping it sticks. If you want your message to truly stick for the hiring manager who works for a specific company, my recommendation is to do the hard work and make sure that your message is tailored to that company. And that could be just by in your cover letter, which I know is a little bit outdated, but I still recommend them, or in your resume or in your note, just sending a link that goes directly to a page on your site that speaks to a project that fits with that company and why you would be a good fit for working for there. I know that seems like a lot of work, but it really is important to help you stand out. It really showcases that you are passionate about design and that you really want that role with a company. So let's talk now about the story arc, because this story arc should show up on your online portfolio site. And basically, this is within a project page on your portfolio, how I recommend that you talk about the work that you've done. And it can be a long page, because part of what you want to do in telling the story around a specific design project in your portfolio is to really showcase the work, show the process of design. So in that story arc, we had the beginning, we had the rising story, we had the climax, then we had resolution and denouement. That's your general standard story arc. There's many different types of story arcs, and they can get much more intricate than that, but that's a generic standard one. I'm recommending you use that same story arc in how you talk about the process of design for a project. Starting with the beginning of the project, what was the discovery phase like for you? What was the customer problem that you were trying to solve with that specific project that you're showcasing? Did you do research? What kind of personas did you have? What were the principles that you developed along the way to help you guide with decisions? What was the customer benefit you were going after? So that could be one full section. And my recommendation for that section is start with the customer problem, because that is the most important part of the whole design process, is truly understanding that customer problem. And then show sketches. How did you sketch out possible solutions? How did you iterate out? How did you do research on this and gain insights around the customer? All of that is really important to me as a hiring manager to understand your thought process and what you might bring to the work here, the company I'm hiring for. So include all of that. Include in the next section, talk more about the concepting work and talk about going broad and how you narrowed all of those principles around design thinking. Showcase them. Did you do paper prototypes? Did you do an envision prototype? Include a link to that envision prototype if you can share it. That's always fantastic for me as a hiring manager to see the actual work in progress. And then in a separate section, as you're going through the story of your project, talk about how you narrowed down and landed on a detailed design. There's always constraints. You can talk about the constraints. That's okay. As designers, we always know that there are constraints. How did you get to your detailed design? What kind of research led you to that solution? Do you have a high-level prototype that you can show? Do you have a movie or video of it? Those are always engaging. And then what kind of additional validation or testing were you able to do? Not everyone can do lots of validation and testing, but it's still great to include that if you can. And then, of course, at the end of the project, how did you measure success? Was it through certain types of KPIs? Was it conversion? Was it revenue? Was it new customers? There's always some kind of measurement or result. And you definitely want to speak to that in terms of your online portfolio. So that's how you talk about one project on your portfolio. But within that project on your site, it's really important to set context. Talk about why you were doing the work, and especially about the customer problem you're trying to solve. Show the process, like I said, with sketches, pictures of sticky notes. All of that is really important. One thing that a lot of people do when they're interviewing in the phone interview and they're talking about what they did, or sometimes, especially on their online portfolios, is they talk about being on a team, but they don't specifically call out what their exact role on that team was. So as you guys know, for most of us in design, getting work done is a collaborative process. It takes many people. But be very clear what your role was. Were you the design leader on that team? Did you drive facilitating brainstorming sessions? Did you do all of the wireframing? Did you do the visual design or consult with a visual designer? Just be very clear, because that helps answer, for me as a hiring manager, many of the questions around fit and why you might be a good person for the role that I'm hiring for, if I can understand the different roles that you've played on projects. And then, of course, in portfolios, people are not very good at including this, and I really recommend this wherever possible, is to talk about your rationale for your design decision. So you landed on a detailed design, but it's important for me as a hiring manager to understand why. What was the rationale behind it? Did you use data to get to that design decision? Best practices? Anything that you include around the rationale shows your thought process. And then, of course, proofread everything. I actually gave this presentation a couple years ago to a very different audience, and it was much rougher. It was actually very different from this. And at the very end, I had this note, of course, on the slide around proofread everything. And someone actually came up to me at the end and said, "Did you know that you had a spelling mistake in the slide somewhere in there?" I'm like, "That's okay. I'm not interviewing for a job." But you guys, make sure someone else is looking at your work and proofread it for you, because those are little tiny things, and most hiring managers won't notice, but a few of us will. And so your online portfolio is your best presentation of yourself. Make sure that it's perfect. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the actual portfolio presentation when you actually go into a company and you're interviewing. So I really want to talk about the show, don't tell principle. So while on your online portfolio site, it is okay to have words to describe the process as long as you have lots of pictures showing the story. In the actual interview process, when you're doing your actual portfolio presentation, it is just as important to show the work. So showcase the actual wireframes, show the sketches, show the rapid prototype that you did, anything that you can do to show your work rather than have a slide with bullet points on it will be a much, much better presentation for those of us in the design industry. So just on principle, always make sure that you're showing rather than telling. And so here, when you're setting up your actual portfolio presentation, my recommendation is to divide your presentation into 4 sections. The first section should be basically a little bit about your personal story. Who are you? A little bit about your design journey, how you became the designer that you are, and what you're most passionate about. And this is important at the beginning of the presentation to kind of set some context for those who are interviewing you, and it really creates that connection with that hiring manager and the interview team. What is it about you personally that might resonate with them? And that puts it in the mindset of how would you be a good fit with the company, how would you connect with your fellow colleagues, both in design and throughout the rest of the company. It's really good to have a personal story. It's also good to have something that people will remember you by. So something personal is always a good connection there. Then lead into project 1, your first project. And this is basically a craft deep dive here, where you're really showcasing your talents in your specific design competency. Why you would be a good fit for the role, and all of the great craft skills that you can bring to bear for that role that you're interviewing for. So really showcase your skills, because you want to be able to show to the hiring manager that you have all the skills that are needed to fit for that specific role. But then use your second project and your deep dive there to showcase what else you're going to bring to the role. And this is where it's really important to know the company and have an idea of their future vision. Are they tackling a lot of mobile? Well, this is how you can also help with mobile. Understand their business strategy. Are they doing more work in fintech, and how can you show some innovation and strategic thinking? Those are really important things to highlight in project 2. And then, of course, it's important to have a conclusion to your story. And this is where you really sum up the things that you can do for that company and why you are the best fit for that role. Leave no doubt with the hiring team that you are the best one for the job. And my recommendation is to thread the skills that you want to showcase to the interview team throughout this entire presentation. So if you know that company is really looking for someone who has a lot of leadership skills and the ability to empower others, you can thread that through the narrative of each of these projects in different ways. So while you may be showcasing the craft, you can then talk about how you showed leadership in a specific way on that project. If the company is really looking for someone who's very innovative and strategic, you can showcase that too. So while you're showing your craft and your skills, you can also talk about some of the strategic thinking that you did as part of the project. Thread that in. It doesn't have to be the whole focus of each of these areas, but it should be a threaded part of the whole narrative. Excuse me. So I talked about the threads and your strengths, but I also think it's important to make the story that you're telling really personal. And this is where it's great to have stories of customers that you've talked to, anecdotes to share. I had one person who came in and interviewed a couple years ago, and she had done a lot of design work as one person doing freelance work, and she put together a project to showcase her skills and her customer empathy, where she went out and she interviewed people for basically a project that she had just put together for herself to show, different prototyping skills. But she went out and interviewed customers for this project that she'd found through Facebook. And she'd reached out and she had them on video, and she had really good interview questions, and it showed a lot of empathy. And so that really spoke to something that I was looking for in someone, really having a good understanding of people and empathy. And so I thought she was a good fit for the role from that. So make it personal if you can. Also, of course, in a portfolio presentation, you're selling yourself for the job. You're showing your best self. But part of being authentic as a human being and as a designer is admitting that we all make mistakes. There are things that we go down a design path and it's not a great one. And it's important to be able to explain why you went down that path and why you ended up pivoting, what you learned from that. Or maybe you had a bad call, you made a bad call on something. Explain what that was. It really showcases that you're able to learn from the mistakes that you make. And of course, we talked about being clear on your role on a project. It's a pet peeve of mine when people constantly talk about we when really they mean I. And so just make sure that you're careful around that. And of course, bookend your story. And that's, with each project, have a strong bookend on the project, and then of course, have a strong bookend as part of your conclusion. So communication and influence. I am a big believer in being your authentic self, but of course, be your best self. So dress well, bring a device to showcase your work on. It could be a tablet or a phone. It doesn't have to be something big, but be mindful of all of the ways that's important in order to impress the interview team. Because it's a lot of time on the part of the interview team, and of course, if you're going for that design job, you're putting a lot of time and effort into putting together your portfolio and your presentation. So you really want it to pay off. Show enthusiasm. Be positive. Get a good night's rest beforehand. Make sure you eat breakfast. Just be on top of it. When people show up for an interview and they're just not put together, and that's an immediate red flag that they won't be put together for the actual job itself. And so I know all of you will make sure that you're dressed well and you're on time. In fact, you're early. But this is just a reminder that those things really matter. And then I'm a big fan of persistence and resilience. One of my favorite people that I've ever hired, I didn't originally hire him. He interviewed out of a master's program, and his interview was it was shaky. It was really shaky. And I gave him that feedback, and I gave him some advice in terms of communicating and how to tell a better story with his portfolio. And he sent me a nice email to thank me, and didn't hear from him. And then a year later, he applied again for a job. And this time, when I looked at his portfolio, his online portfolio, I could see that he had really taken to heart a lot of what I had said in terms of my feedback to him a year earlier. And I could see that he'd grown as a designer in that year. And when he came back and he interviewed on site for a role, he nailed it. He had taken everything I had said to heart and presented himself so very well. And to this day, he just remains a great person and a fabulous designer. And I'm so glad that he persevered. And then, of course, when someone is unrehearsed, it sounds unrehearsed. It sounds stilted. So practice, find a confidant, find a friend, and walk through your portfolio 5 times, 10 times. Buy them lunch, buy them dinner, buy them a bottle of wine. It's so important for you to practice with other people in order to get their feedback so that you can craft your best presentation and your best portfolio. So I put this in here. I think it's really important at the end of any interview to ask for feedback from the hiring manager. Not everyone does this, but I think it's really important. And as I said, one person who came back, interviewed for the second time, had really listened to the feedback that I gave him at the end of his first interview a year earlier. And he had really taken that to heart. And so my recommendation, you may not get the job or you may get it, but it never hurts to ask for feedback about how you did in terms of what you were presenting, your portfolio, your skills, what you can do better in the future. Not only does it set you up for your next interview, because it gives you insight into how you can do better, but it also shows the hiring manager that you are an active listener and that you have a growth mindset. They're open to learning new things and ways that you can be better. And as a hiring manager, I am looking for that in every single person I hire. So that's my recommendation. End every interview, if possible, asking for feedback in a nice way. So with that, we are on to the Q&A section. So Brian, I don't know if you're fielding questions, but I am ready.
Yes, I am.
Okay,
yeah,
wonderful.
We've received a number of questions up to this point, and any questions that I could answer on the fly, I did so. Some were comments, and basically you're getting a lot of engagement, and there's some people that are particularly inspired by Intuit and the words you're saying. So yay, team.
Yay.
Along those lines, I'm going to go through the specific questions. So far, there's at least 2 questions that have had multiple people ask them. So,
oh, okay.
And there's also 2 individuals that have asked multiple questions, so I'm going to do my best here to parse through that.
Okay, great.
Do you want me to begin with the more recent questions or the more early questions?
I'm open to anything. You
right.
just...
The last 2 questions pertain to feedback and asking for it, a topic you just covered. Specifically from Ann Jackson, regarding asking for feedback, do you mean during the interview itself? And can you give examples, please, on how to word that? Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. So I like it, usually as a hiring manager, I interview the person last. I have the last one-on-one interview with them. And it's a time for me to probe on any outstanding questions that I have in terms of whether they'd be a good fit for the role. And it's a great time for them to ask me questions because it's a 2-sided problem, of course. You know, I'm looking for someone who's a good fit for my company, but you as a designer who's interviewing should be looking for a company that's a great fit for you. And so I always think it's good at the end, after you've asked your questions of the hiring manager, is to say something like, thank you so much for the interview. This has been a great experience. Do you have any feedback for me at this time? And that opens up the conversation. And say it in a nice way, nicer than I just said it. And of course, don't put someone on the spot. A lot of hiring managers will say, that's an interesting question. Let me think about it. And they won't have an answer right there. But some will be able to say, like, that was a great portfolio. I really wish that you talked about I really wish you'd shown more wireframes or something like that. And that feedback is really, really instructive for you in terms of how you can craft your next portfolio. And it also opens up the opportunity to then go to that hiring manager and say, oh, that's great feedback. I didn't showcase enough wireframes in my portfolio, but I have a whole bunch that I would love to send you later. And that opens up the opportunity to then send an email with a collection of wireframes for that hiring manager to review, along with a little thank you for the time that they spent interviewing. That's always a nice way to sum up and bookend the whole full interview process.
We had another question pertaining to feedback in terms of channel. I think you've probably covered that for the most part. If that is not agreed upon, Suzanne, please ask your question again. Likewise, in person versus later, I suspect based on the conversation so far, it depends, and probably both based on that interaction. There has been. Go ahead.
So I will say for the person who I interviewed a year before and then came back and interviewed again, I gave him feedback at the end of that first interview, and I think he followed up a few weeks later via LinkedIn and just asked for some additional feedback. So, you know, of course, I would do that with a friendly hiring manager. So you have to read the hiring manager correctly. But I think you can follow up post-interview through something like LinkedIn or through email and ask for additional feedback. I think that is quite okay.
There's also a number of questions pertaining to depth and robustness of the portfolio. How many pieces you put in there, how complex should those pieces be, so on and so forth.
Yes, so I think it's really important, as I said, I would frame it in just 2 projects, because to do a deep dive on a project generally takes about 15 minutes or so to really walk through the work and get into the customer problems and show the detail. So the depth really, it's kind of a not awesome answer, but the depth also depends on the type of project. Some projects are quick and iterative, and you want to showcase being able to work fast, but others are very complex, and it is important to take the time and go through the complexity. Now, it's also important to read the room, and if you see that people are glazing over because you're going into too much detail, by all means, move forward in that presentation. And always have backup materials. So while you may cover a project at a certain level in the actual portfolio presentation, in the follow-up interviews, that's a good time. If someone says, you know, I'd love to talk more about this project, then you can say, that's great, I have some additional detailed wireframes to show you, and I'd love to talk through some of the problems I've resolved in those wireframes. Something like that is always very helpful.
2 other questions that are being asked by a number of different individuals. Most of the conversation so far has been focused more around designers.
Yes, that's true.
We do have a number of people here that are researchers who are apparently open and interested in the concept of a portfolio from a research perspective. Having been both a researcher and a designer myself and helped teams with both of those focuses, I personally believe that there's no downside to researchers having a portfolio as well, but we'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts here.
That is a fantastic question. I have actually interviewed a number of researchers. And I think that this idea of how you present your online portfolio and how you structure your portfolio presentation holds true for researchers as well as designers. And so the harder part for researchers sometimes, not always, but sometimes, is to make your portfolio visually appealing. But that's where, if that's not one of your strengths, that's where you find someone who is very good at making your portfolio as visually appealing as possible and helping you frame out the work that you've done. So it's still about, when you're a researcher, it's still about the problem that you're trying to solve and the ways that you did that, right? The different concepts that you did for research, you iterated out, how you tested things. So you still have the same story arc and the same principles for how you tell that story. My call out, my watch out for a lot of the researchers who I have interviewed is to also then frame it very in a nice way so it's visually appealing, because that will 100% help you stand out from other researchers. And also to, again, be able to tell a story in terms of the research that you were trying to do. Bring in empathy, bring in customers as much as you can, or pictures of the people that you're researching, the problems that you're researching. Tell a beautiful story along with your work.
We have another similar question that's had a lot of focus so far from I think about 6 individuals. So
Okay.
a lot of us who've done design work have done so for larger organizations, and that work is sometimes under an NDA and/or includes or details proprietary information.
Yeah.
What are some strategies for addressing that when you really want to also show the work?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And so I think in your online portfolio, that's where it gets difficult because you want to showcase your work, but you're under an NDA. So you have to be very respectful of that from a legal perspective. If there's any way to scrub out any identifying information in the work for your online portfolio, please do that. Because as a hiring manager, it is really tough for me to bring in someone unless I've seen some semblance of the work, some idea of what the work might be. And again, it depends on the hiring manager on how open they are to seeing work that's under an NDA in the actual interview process when someone comes on site. And so for that, because there's legal reasons around that, I would say ask the hiring manager before you interview with them whether you can showcase the work without revealing any information. We try to be very careful here, obviously, at Intuit because of the legal requirements. But it's really important. If you can't show the work because it's under an NDA, you have to find other work to show. You really do. Or you have to talk about the larger problem that you were trying to solve in that project and how you did it without using identifying information. And that's really tough. I know everyone finds that really tough, but it's really important to figure out a way to do that.
That's actually a very key point. There's 3 questions. I'm going to conflate them a little bit that we received, but it almost joins up with that theme pretty well. We have a number of people that have been talking about how do you show work on stuff for an industry that you haven't worked in, but maybe you've done related work, or along those lines, if you've done student work, but it's not for a real client necessarily, how can you showcase that? Or even if it's something a little bit aspirational that you did on the side, but hasn't borne fruition yet, how can that be addressed?
Yeah, so I'll start with the aspirational work that's done on the side. I think that work is always great to showcase because it shows that you are learning new things outside of your current role and that you're building on your skills and all those wonderful things that as a hiring manager I want to see. Now, make that side project as professional as you possibly can and definitely adhere to all of the principles and tenets that I laid out in the rest of this presentation for that side project. And definitely, even if it's a side project and it hasn't totally come to fruition, definitely find ways to show measures of success and how you followed, the design thinking process.
And if along the way you didn't happen to grab that perfect photo of the work, recreate it as best you can and/or move on.
Absolutely, absolutely. For students, student portfolios are fantastic. They're awesome. It's very important when you're a student in your portfolio to be very clear on the specific role that you had. That's one thing that students frequently do is they just talk about the team did this and they aren't specific on their role. Includes student work, but always talk about the fact that it was a student project and that it was done within a certain time period to solve a specific problem, and talk about the things that you learned from it. Those are all very important things as a student to showcase. But yeah, I mean, if you're a student coming out of school, that's the work that you have. Now, if possible, try to do other side work that showcases your professional side as well, because that, as a hiring manager, I'm looking for someone who has experience. And to get experience, you have to have some experience. So try to do more than just your student work, your classroom work, and showcase other projects as well. And there was a first part of that question, Brian, that I don't think I answered.
Well, if that's the case, I'm sure somebody will let us know.
Okay.
But basically, it was aspirational work, stuff that you didn't happen to capture, maybe things that need to be refined, and then we moved to that from the NDA scenario. There were 2 questions asked about, the quantity of work watermarks in a portfolio. That was the first question I believe we led off with. That pertained to, I think you basically said it depends, it's a short version, but you want to be able to show enough and you have to profile the target employer.
Yeah.
But if you want to elaborate on that, you can. We did have a couple of questions here from Jason pertaining to, okay, this is all great stuff, but what do you have to do differently if you're going up for a management level role and not somebody who's a designer or researcher or maybe a lead designer researcher, but ultimately, what should be different when you're going for a management role?
Yeah, so when you're a manager or going for a manager role, the important thing there is, of course, show the craft competency. But you also then want to amplify your leadership skills. And these may not be leadership skills that that show up in terms of your resume, but how are you a leader in your current role? How are you empowering others? How are you bringing the team together? Showcase those throughout the narrative thread. How did you lead that project specifically? And I think it's always good as well to include information in your portfolio in the interview process around how you're mentoring others and growing them, because that's what you really need when you're trying to move into a manager role. Is how would you lead a team? How would you solve conflict? How would you resolve issues and show those strengths just as part of your current narrative in the role that you are doing today?
Okay, couple final questions. If you have a portfolio but it hasn't been updated in a long time, is it better to leave it up while you're working on a new one or take it down with a coming soon text or something else?
Well, if you haven't updated in a long time, I'm not sure it'd be a good idea to send it out to hiring managers as you're looking for a job. You can leave it up, but if you are starting to send out your portfolio link to hiring managers, make sure that it is your best presentation of yourself. And so that means take that weekend and spend however many hours it takes to put up the new work. Make sure that it is the best representation of yourself, or it will get into the hands of hiring managers, and that will be one more dead end for you. So you don't want that to happen.
Are there specific to, I'm sorry to cut you off, keep going. If you.
Well, I would just want to make sure it's clear. Get that work done and get it up. I know when I'm mentoring people and they keep telling me, oh, I'm still working on it, I'm still working on it. That's not what I want to hear. I want to hear that they have really put in the time and gotten that portfolio up. And it may not have all the projects that you want to showcase, but as long as you have 2 or 3 really good curated projects up, consider that your first foot forward and then add to it. But make sure those 2 or 3 projects that you have up are amazing projects.
And that's good. Basically, the quality is more important than quantity.
Absolutely.
Are there specific tools in terms of assembling the portfolio that you would recommend? I mean, some people are going to do PowerPoint, or some people are going to be doing something else.
It's really up to you and what you are able to use quickly. I'm a big fan of Keynote or PowerPoint for your actual portfolio presentation, but anywhere that you can show a prototype or a movie or those kinds of things, that always helps in the process as well. It's okay to use one of those template websites, but make sure that it doesn't look like a template website. Make sure that it looks personalized and as if you put your mark on it.
And one final question. Just be respectful of that we're nearing the top of the hour. What are some of your biggest pet peeves? I know this was on your bio, and I know you have a few, but being able to curtail poor habits would be very helpful.
Sure, yeah. So I think, again, I had typos on there as a pet peeve and not showing up with a device to show your portfolio on. I think it's also a pet peeve of mine when people show up for an interview and they clearly have done no research on the company that they're interviewing with, or they haven't even looked, like they know I'm the hiring manager and they haven't looked up anything about me. Those are small pet peeves, but you know, they can add up. And then of course, it's a pet peeve when people don't present themselves well. You know, it's okay to be artistic and designery. You don't have to show up in a suit and tie. Like, be authentic as a designer. that's awesome. But make sure you're wearing a clean shirt and make sure you look like you have some rest. Like those are just some basic things.
I'm going to ask one final question because we did get a late submission. I'm trying to figure out how to parse this. Any advice with an eye towards making a career switch into the design field, specifically in terms of populating the portfolio with meaningful projects? I think this may lend itself to a cart and horse thing if you don't necessarily have a lot to showcase, but that could be a good way to wrap up this discussion too.
Yeah, so start with what you have. It could be tangential to being a designer, but as long as you can showcase the skills that would make you a good designer, you can include it. And then, of course, start building up with actual design work and show how you have those skills.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for your time. Sharon, thank you so much for your time. If anyone has additional questions, Sharon can be reached on LinkedIn via Sharon Carmichael and then the number 1. If you have questions for UXPA, we are again on Twitter, UXPA_INT, and along those lines, please reach out to us. You can also reach out to me, Brian Mills UX on Twitter, brian.mills@uxpa.org. Particularly if you have any questions about how to launch or form your own chapter. And if you have any other feedback, this would be really helpful about what we can do better for these sessions. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Great. Thank you so much.